Let me start with something that might surprise all of you. What if I told you that behind the scenes, there have already been attempts to bring together two political figures who seemed completely opposed just a short while ago? Yes, I am talking about Rigathi Gachagua and Uhuru Kenyatta. And according to reports, those talks are not happening casually. They were reportedly being mediated by Kalonzo Musyoka with involvement from the former Nigerian President Olusegun Obasanjo. If that sounds very surprising, that is because Kenyan politics often moves quietly before the public sees the final picture. So today, let's examine something very carefully. Could reconciliation between Gachagua and Uhuru really happen? And if it did, what would that mean for Kenyan politics, especially heading into 2027? To understand why this question matters, we have to go back to the political tensions of the last electoral cycle. During 2022, the election period of 2022, the political lines were extremely clear. Uhuru Kenyatta on this side was supporting the late Raila Odinga, and on the other side, Honorable Rigathi Gachagua stood firmly alongside our President William Samoei Ruto. And the political messaging between these two camps was not subtle. Mount Kenya politics in particular became very heated. There were accusations, there were criticisms, and there were very strong public statements. At that moment, the idea of Uhuru and Gachagua ever sitting down politically would have sounded almost impossible. But here is something important about politics. Political conflicts, especially here in Kenya, are often very temporary. What matters more is interests. And interests change over time. Now here is where the story becomes very interesting. A report by KTN News suggested that efforts had already been made to ease the tension between these two leaders. According to that report by KTN, Kalonzo Musyoka had been involved mediating discussions between former President Uhuru Kenyatta and former Deputy President Rigathi Gachagua. And in the mediation, reportedly, included a very respected African statesman, Olusegun Obasanjo. Now let me say something very important here. I cannot independently verify or confirm the full details of those conversations, but according to KTN, which is a very reliable news station, discussions were being reported, and that tells us something very significant. In politics, the conversations that matter the most are rarely the ones that usually happen in public. The ones that happen quietly are usually the most important ones. The ones that happen behind closed doors, long before even the public sees it. And in fact, the report even suggested that a potential handshake between these two leaders had been discussed. Now, whether the handshake ever happens or whether it will happen is still very uncertain, but the existence of such conversations alone tells us something is cooking. Political doors that look completely closed may not actually be closed. Now let's look at why reconciliation might even be considered. The answer begins with the Mount Kenya region. Mount Kenya remains one of the most influential voting blocs in the country. Any national coalition hoping to win power in this country usually needs very strong support from this region. And because of that, the leaders who influence Mount Kenya politics become extremely important in national politics. Now think about the current situation. The former President Uhuru Kenyatta may no longer be president, but he still holds symbolic and network influence in certain political and economic spaces. At the same time, the former Deputy President Rigathi Gachagua, on the other hand, has positioned himself as a strong political voice defending Mount Kenya interests from within the government and outside the government. So in different ways, both of these leaders represent influence connected to the same region. And that creates a very interesting political question. Would a divided Mount Kenya leadership weaken the region's bargaining power in national politics? Historically, when political blocs appear divided, their influence usually becomes very fragmented. Case example, the Western Kenya. But when they appear united, their negotiating power often increases. So from a purely strategic perspective, reconciliation among those two would strengthen regional political leverage. But politics is not just about strategy. Of course, reconciliation in politics is rarely about strategy. There is also history. There is pride involved. There are public statements that cannot be easily forgotten. So the political tensions between the previous administration and the current leadership were very intense. The former Deputy President Rigathi Gachagua was among the leaders who strongly criticized the previous government. We can all remember their inauguration speech. And those words were spoken very publicly. Politics has a long memory. So if reconciliation were ever to happen, it would require something important, a change in incentives. Political reconciliation usually happens when both sides see that cooperation offers more advantage than continued conflict. And sometimes that realization comes only after years and years later. Kenyan politics has seen this before. Kenyan politics has produced many surprising alliances over the years. Leaders who once campaigned very fiercely against each other and have later formed political partnerships when circumstances changed. This is because politics is rarely personal. It is usually very strategic. Today's rival can become tomorrow's partner if the political moment demands it. That is why experienced political observers do not dismiss these ideas or possibilities too quickly. Because alliances in politics are always evolving. So instead of asking only whether reconciliation will happen, the more interesting question would be, what political circumstances could make this reconciliation beneficial for both sides? That is the real question. Would it be regional unity? Would it be national coalition building? Would it be preparation for political realities in 2027? We don't yet know. But politics often moves in stages. First, quiet conversations that we don't get to see. The next one would be subtle signals coming from both camps. Then the last one, public meetings. And only much later, a handshake. So let me leave you with this thought. Right now, reconciliation between the former Deputy President Rigathi Gachagua and former President Uhuru Kenyatta may still feel unlikely to very many people. But politics is not static. It is constantly shifting. And sometimes, the biggest political development starts with conversations that the public almost never sees. So when you hear reports about mediation, or quiet discussions, or a possible handshake, don't dismiss them too quickly. Because those small signals can sometimes reveal the early stages of a much bigger political realignment that is happening. And if leaders like Gachagua and former President Uhuru Kenyatta were ever to find a common ground again, it would not just change Mount Kenya politics. It would reshape the entire political landscape heading into the 2027 elections. And that is why moments like this are worth watching carefully. Because in politics, power is not only contested between parties, it is also negotiated quietly behind the scenes. My name is Doreen Cherotich Sigilai. I am a political analyst and a governance expert. Kindly follow me on all my pages, that is TikTok, YouTube, and Facebook. I value your honest feedback. Until the next video, see you and bye.